This morning, I awoke with an excruciating stomach ache that felt as though a ball of thorns had taken up residence in my digestive system. The pain was so unbearable that I couldn't muster the strength to stand or even utter a sound. In my agony, I rolled out of bed and inadvertently landed on my dog, who usually slept on the floor nearby. He began to whimper, and as much as I wanted to comfort him by rubbing his belly, I was immobilized by the pain. In response to my distress, my dog started barking, seemingly oblivious to my suffering. Sometimes, I couldn't help but wonder if my loyal companion had a touch of cluelessness. Couldn't he see that I was in agony? I felt utterly numb, my pain so intense that I couldn't even reach for my cell phone. In that moment, I teetered on the brink of losing consciousness, contemplating the idea of simply closing my eyes and greeting the angels. Surprisingly, just when it felt like my stomach might tear itself apart, my dog did something unexpected. He stood on his hind legs and skillfully used his nose to nudge my cell phone off the nightstand, pushing it closer to my hand. It was a revelation. He wasn't as clueless as I had thought. Summoning every ounce of strength, I managed to call 911. The operator on the line was incredibly helpful, swiftly dispatching an ambulance. Within minutes, the paramedics arrived at my house, knocking on the door as my dog barked from inside. Believing it to be an emergency, they eventually resorted to kicking in the door. My faithful canine guided them to my room, where they discovered my incapacitated state. As soon as I glimpsed one of the paramedics, I succumbed to unconsciousness. The next thing I knew, I was in a hospital bed, disoriented and unaware of the time or my surroundings. A voice greeted me, "Hello, sleepyhead," but my vision was still hazy, and I couldn't make out who it belonged to. I found myself in a state of dizziness and confusion. "Where am I?" I murmured, my stomach searing with a sharp pain that contorted my face as if I were biting into a lemon. The voice reassured me, "Rest, sweetheart." My vision was still blurry, but I could sense a needle in my arm, and the stranger's touch on my arm as she administered something through the needle. My eyes rolled back, and I succumbed to unconsciousness once more. Morning sunlight streamed into the room when I next awoke, casting its warm glow upon my face. My mind had cleared, and I realized that I was alone in a hospital room. As I surveyed my surroundings, my eyes widened in shock at the horrifying sight that met them. My stomach. It was distended, resembling nothing less than a giant pumpkin lodged within me. Had I somehow crossed over into a bizarre alternate reality, where I, a mere 14-year-old, had mysteriously become pregnant? My trembling hands lifted the sheets, revealing a belly swollen to the size of a hot air balloon. Tears welled up and streamed down my face, my sobs echoing through the room. My anguish was so intense that a nurse rushed in, urgently speaking to me, though her words were lost in the tumult of my emotions. I was horrified, grappling with the impossible truth that I, at my tender age, was carrying a child. No. No. This can't be happening. I cried out. It felt unreal, like a drug-induced haze or a dreadful nightmare. The nurse attempted to calm me, but my screams continued unabated. I couldn't fathom how this had come to pass. All I could recall was a simple kiss shared with Gavin by the swings during recess. It couldn't be real. It had to be a dream, or perhaps I was under some kind of influence. To my astonishment, the nurse began laughing, her laughter drowning out my cries of distress. I stared at her in disbelief. Could she find humor in this dire situation? Our exchange was interrupted by a sudden knock on the door, and my father rushed into the room, his eyes circled with exhaustion, as if he hadn't slept in days. "I thought I had lost you," he exclaimed, his face etched with deep concern. My father was visibly relieved that I was all right, but he seemed more preoccupied with getting me out of the hospital. "You shouldn't be here." "Why did they bring you here?" he asked, his behavior appearing peculiar. He attempted to lift me, his intentions clear, he wanted to take me home. However, I was adamantly against leaving with him. Overwhelmed by weakness, I needed to rest. Initially, my father seemed oblivious to my bloated abdomen, and I couldn't fathom why he was behaving so strangely. However, as he finally noticed my prominent belly, he began gasping for breath. I wondered how other parents might react in a similar situation. Surely not like my dad. Unexpectedly, he exclaimed, "I'm going to be a grandpa." His reaction caught me off guard, and I was on the verge of another freakout. But then, the nurse laughed once more, setting off an even stranger chain of events. My dad's behavior took a bizarre turn as he insisted on leaving the hospital immediately, even shouting at the nurse and physically removing my fore from my artery, causing me great discomfort. "Dad, ouch!" I protested, alarmed by his erratic actions. In response to my father's escalating behavior, the nurse summoned hospital security to escort him out of the room. I had never witnessed my dad so out of control. He remained outside the hospital until I was discharged, his outburst still fresh in my mind. As the pain in my stomach intensified once more, my focus shifted away from his peculiar actions. The nurse gently placed her hands on my distended belly, applying pressure with both palms. A buildup of pressure culminated in the release of trapped air, resulting in a loud burp that left me bright red with embarrassment. My lips quivered, and the curtains hanging beside my bed fluttered in the released air's gentle current. Despite my embarrassment, the nurse managed to put me at ease. She reinserted my fore and administered a sleep-inducing medication. Sometime during the night, I awoke to commotion in my room, catching a glimpse of my father and the nurse engaged in a struggle that resembled an embrace. My tired mind couldn't quite decipher the situation, and I drifted back to sleep. Later, I was stirred from slumber by the sensation of movement and the rattling of wheels. My surroundings indicated that I was being transported down a long corridor. When I looked down, I was relieved to find that my stomach had finally returned to its normal size. I wondered if I was being wheeled into another room, perhaps for a different procedure. There was a reassuring hand on my shoulder, or so I thought. But as I turned to look, I realized that it wasn't the nurse attending to me, it was my father. Strangely, he was dressed in a nurse's uniform, which gave me a moment's pause. Although I knew my dad would never harm me, my disoriented state left me feeling distrustful. Summoning whatever strength I could muster, I attempted to halt the wheelchair's progress, my voice trembling with fear. "Dad, stop. You're scaring me." I cried out, but it seemed like he couldn't hear me. My father concealed his face and hair behind a medical mask and a nurse's cap, making him resemble a surprisingly convincing nurse. Approaching us was a doctor who greeted my father with familiarity. "Morning, sister," the doctor said. My father, his voice altered to mimic a woman's, responded, "Morning, doctor. I need you in room 436 to assist in surgery in 10 minutes. "I'll be there, Dr. Charming," the doctor replied casually. It was surreal to witness my father playing along as a nurse, and it appeared that he was enjoying it. He wheeled me into an unoccupied patient's room and pretended to review the patient's chart attached to the bed. He even placed a thermometer in the patient's mouth and examined her vital signs, acting out the role with utmost seriousness. To my surprise, my father remarked under his breath that I would have excelled as a doctor if only I had been granted admission to medical school. I couldn't recall my dad ever expressing such aspirations before. Then, out of nowhere, my father froze, wearing a mischievous grin. "Oh, they need me in surgery," he muttered, pushing my wheelchair into a nearby closet. I made a feeble attempt to rise, but my weakness left me immobile, and I desperately needed to rest. My father locked the closet door behind him and headed toward the operating room. Approximately half an hour later, I could hear commotion and shouts echoing through the hospital, with people urgently exclaiming, "Get him. He's not a nurse." It became apparent that my father's ruse had been discovered. I heard hurried footsteps approaching, and then he burst back into the closet, seizing the wheelchair, and sped through the hospital's corridors. Fear gripped me as I screamed and struggled to free myself, but the wheelchair moved too swiftly. It collided with medical equipment and food trays, and at one point, it skidded on a spill on the floor. The nurses summoned security, But my father pressed on, creating chaos in the hallways as he passed doctors, patients, and visitors. He steered the wheelchair towards the elevator, hitting the button for the top floor as we entered. As we turned around, I watched security guards sprinting in our direction. It was an unusual and frightening situation to be in with my own father. Normally, I felt secure with him, but today was different. I found myself wishing that the guards would intervene and save me from my dad's erratic behavior. He was behaving wildly, sticking out his tongue, taunting the approaching security personnel. The elevator's doors closed just before the guards could reach us, and the display showed the number of the top floor. We were ascending, and something was definitely amiss. I wondered why we weren't heading to the basement where our car should have been parked. Inside the elevator, my father was dancing and laughing manically, showing signs of dangerous unpredictability. Fear consumed me. My dad had done so many irrational things, and I knew he could potentially harm someone, or even me. I was trembling with fear, desperately wanting the security guards to come to our rescue. Upon reaching the top floor, the elevator doors opened, and fortunately, security guards were waiting there. I screamed at the top of my lungs, "Help! Help!" My dad let out a cry and forcefully pushed me towards the security guards before making a run for it, his nurse's uniform fluttering in the air as he disappeared within the hospital premises. The guards immediately pursued him, leaving me behind. Determination surged within me as I realized I had to follow them. Summoning every last ounce of strength, I struggled to hoist myself out of the wheelchair. My legs felt weak and shaky, but I could manage to walk again. I assumed that my father would take the stairs for his escape, as there was no other way. I took the elevator, stopping at each floor along the way. Despite my fear, I also felt a strong urge to help him, sensing that something was seriously wrong. With each floor's opening, I peered out, hoping to catch a glimpse of him. Finally, when I reached the 8th floor, I spotted my father, still dressed in the nurse's attire, gesticulating wildly at someone. My scream pierced the air, and when my dad turned to face me, disbelief washed over me. The man he was standing next to also looked exactly like my dad, wearing his signature trucker hat. I couldn't comprehend what I was seeing, two identical versions of my dad in front of me. One had been acting completely unhinged, pretending to be a nurse, while the other sported his familiar trucker cap. The shock and my physical weakness overwhelmed me, causing me to collapse. The next thing I knew, I was waking up in a hospital bed. My real dad, the one who had always been there for me, sat by my side, holding my hand. It turned out that the imposter who had pretended to be a nurse had escaped from a nearby mental hospital. He bore an uncanny resemblance to my father, and the medication I was on had significantly impaired my judgment. It had also negatively affected my digestion, leading to the rupture of a part of my intestine and causing the bloating I now experienced. I remained in the hospital for nearly 2 days, where I underwent an emergency operation to address the intestinal issue. Though I bore a small scar on my stomach as a result, I felt significantly better when it was all over. A few days later, I was discharged, with my real father by my side, ensuring my safety and well-being.